So once it's actually running in the foreground, application will terminate. If the user holds down the button and clicks the X on an icon, you do have a chance to do some last-minute housekeeping before they even force quit their application. So these are all hooks into those very low-level operations. Notice that there are comments inside of them, but nothing is actually happening. I can actually safely delete all of them. That won't break the class, because what class does AppDelegate descend from? UI responder. So if I actually dig a little deeper, it turns out that those methods are probably implemented elsewhere, higher in this class hierarchy for me. So even though the templates that Apple provides often have lots and lots of code, a lot of it, just to kind of focus and simplify things, you can start deleting, at least if there's no built-in functionality there. And in all of the lecture examples tonight, I've done that in advance. As you'll see, I've pruned away anything that's superfluous so we can only focus on what's core to those applications. So incredibly underwhelming. Before we take a break, let's at least reassure that we can do more interesting things. I'm going to go ahead and rapidly create a new project, single view application, because this time I want a view. I want something on the damn screen. I'm going to call this test 2, but we'll come back with more interesting examples. I'm going to uncheck use storyboards for now. More on that to come. I'm going to click next. I'm going to go ahead and save it on my desktop. I am now going to notice, but explain later, a few new files, view controller. That's good. We have some brains for my application now. But also this xib file, pronounced, of course, nib, N-I-B, for historical reasons. As soon as the nib file became an XML file, they renamed it xib, but we still say nib. Now notice nib, or .xib. Ooh, this makes programming look fun now all of a sudden. This loads what's effectively a tool called Interface Builder, although Apple doesn't really call it that anymore because it's embedded right into Xcode itself. This is how easy it's going to be to start making at least the simplest of applications UIs. I'm going to go to my little palette here on the right-hand side, and notice that there's some juicy, friendly-looking stuff down here. Label, rounded rectangular button, segmented control, slider, switch, progress view. So some familiar UI mechanisms. I'm going to do a super simple one like label. I'm going to drop it over here, roughly in the, let's say, top middle of the screen. I'm going to say hello class. OK, it's still centered. Now I'm going to click the run button at top left, which will launch the simulator. And if all is well, now we have the beginnings of a more interesting application. So let's take a 5-minute break here. We'll come back and actually say how to make that and more. All right, we are back. So the exciting cliffhanger before we took a break was to get hello class onto the screen. But before we forge ahead and reveal just how this magic happens, any questions about Objective-C, UIKit, or anything thus far? Really? OK. Red rectangle on yours.
It should be on all.
Oh, let me see if I can replicate that. Let's see. How did you get that onto your screen? You have it at the bottom of the UI view?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. It has to do with hooks. They're similar in spirit to these, which we will talk about, that allow you to drag and drop more easily onto the surface of this object. We don't have much in this. Let's see. Click here. I am not sure where that feature has been tucked away. I will try to replicate it after, and we can look at it on your screen. OK. Yep. That's because when you created your project for single view application, you left use storyboards checked. And we'll come back to that. But for now, I thought I'd simplify and uncheck that if you'd like to refollow those steps. All right, so we are back now with this single view application. And we seem to have a couple of more files. We still have an app delegate. We still have an appdelegate.h and .m specifically. But we've got at least 3 new files. And just in case there's even more going on underneath the hood, let's zoom in on these groups, these folders over here. Those files look familiar. I don't think there's anything new in there. The file is called test2 instead of test now, but that's because I renamed my project. So all of this looks familiar. Nothing else is new underneath the hood. And indeed, if we look at main.m, There's nothing new there. It's still called app delegate, and somehow that's kicking off this process. So let's ignore those supporting files, and let's go into appdelegate.h to see what's new here. Let me hide this window on the right-hand side for simplicity. And does anything jump out at you as new in this example versus the empty application we wrote first? Yeah, there's a view controller. So this is interesting. We have two properties, not one. And we needed that original property window just so that we had something to hang on to somehow called the UI window. And it was assigned to that property in appdelegate.m. But now we've got another property, also strong and non-atomic, which for now just take on faith as copy-paste when you declare a property like this. It's apparently a pointer called view controller, lowercase v, and it points to an object of type view controller, capital V. So I don't quite know what that is in terms of iOS's world, but view controller, it's a controller, which was what in general terms? What's the view controller? What's a controller? Yeah, so it was the brains of the operation. So MVC. So recall one paradigm. Let's see. Let's really give me at least one chance to swipe. All right, so we had this picture over here, MVC. So the view controller in the world of iOS is just the C in MVC. So it's the brains of our application. Now in reality, as you start writing more and more complex applications, you might very well have more than one view controller, more than just one C. And you might have a super important controller that somehow delegates control among other controllers, but it's still the brains of the operation ultimately. So let's dive into the H file, as should be a common technique, to just see what's going on inside of viewcontroller.h. That is very underwhelming. So my viewController class is apparently a child of the UI viewController class, and that's where the story ends. There's nothing going on, at least inside of the H file. So let's take a look at appdelegate.m before we look at that other method file. What else is new here? Well, I'm a little overwhelmed by all the lines here, but I realize that, almost all of this is comments. So for simplicity, let me go ahead and throw away everything that looks uninteresting in this template and zoom in only on the code that remains. Now this first line, self.window, this looks familiar, right? It was a little verbose, but it allocated a UI window, figured out its dimensions, and gave me a pointer there too by storing it in my window property. Okay, so it's something to hang on to, even though we didn't do anything interesting with it yet. Now, what line of code is new in this method called application did finish launching with options? Yeah, self.viewController. So here's something interesting. Even though this application only puts hello class on the screen, this line of code looks new. So self.viewController is referring to what, to be clear? Say again? The viewController property. So self.viewController is the property that was declared in what file? appdelegate.h, exactly. So we're assigning to that property the return value of this expression here. So a little bit of this is new. ViewController alloc. So alloc allocates me a new object of type ViewController. Who wrote the ViewController class? Apple, at least in the form of the template code, but they seem to have given me the raw source code for the ViewController class, as we just saw from viewcontroller.h, so I can take over the brains of this operation. They did not give me the source code for UI ViewController, but that's fine, because my ViewController class can still descend from it in terms of a hierarchy. It can be my parent nonetheless. So give me a ViewController object, and then initialize it with nib name. So here we see the N for nib, for, again, historical reasons. But nib name. A nib is, at the end of the day, just an XML file. But it's not an XML file we will ever look at. You can, but it's just not interesting, and it's rather overwhelming. A nib file is just a file that stores the result of creating a user interface using Xcode by dragging and dropping widgets like I did earlier. I dragged the simplest of them, just a label, but I could start dragging, as you saw, sliders and knobs and switches and text fields and other such things. A nib file just stores that result of all that dragging and dropping so that you can program at least your UI a little more easily. Now, you don't have to program your UI with Xcode in that way. We'll see it and do it a much more manual way. But what this does is it initializes my ViewController with the contents of a file called nib name is view controller. If I read the documentation, I will see that that method, init with nib name, is supposed to look for, by default, the string that's in quotes, dot xib. So that's how I'm linking my code in Objective-C to what we called the nib file earlier, which again I got for free via this template. So that's where my code is saying, give me a view controller and initialize it with the contents of that XML file. So in other words, if I created that user interface a week ago by dragging and dropping labels and text fields and sliders a week ago and saved it, this reloads it into the program's memory. So lastly, another new line, self.window.control